Hey, Matt at Motorsports. In front of me, I have the new Gen 3 Formline manifolds for all 3.5 liter Gen 3 EcoBoost. Behind me, a 2022 Raptor that we're going to install these on today. Inside the box, you're going to find your stainless Formline manifolds for both left and right side. Manifold gaskets. A new EGR fitting, a packet of anti-seize, and Inconel studs and nuts. Of course, we include a full race sticker. If you did not purchase an install kit with your Formline manifolds, I highly suggest it. You're going to need it. It comes with necessary gaskets and filters that you're going to have to replace. Head on back to fullrace.com and make sure you add that. To get started, of course, we're going to rack the truck. Corey's going to pull the wheels off, and we're going to get to work. For safety reasons, before we do anything, we're going to remove the negative terminal of the battery. This will be a 10 millimeter. We'll start by racking the truck, lifting it in the air, taking the front wheels off. Next, you'll take the fender flares off. There will be 5 7 millimeter screws holding the flares on. Behind the flare, there will be a clip that will need to be released that connects the side blinker light. Now to get the fender liner out, you will have 5 plastic clips and 7 7 millimeter screws. The 5 plastic clips are inside the wheel well. 7 millimeter screws, you have 5 on the outside and 2 inside. Fender liner does tend to come out a little easier if you start at the rear and work your way forward. We'll now move on to the driver's side of the vehicle and repeat the process. The driver's side is a little bit more complicated because of the electrical components that are attached to the underside of the fender liner, but it's pretty much the same process. Again, just like the liner, the fender flares do tend to pop off easier if you start from the rear and work your way forward. Before we take the driver's side fender liner out, we're going to lower the truck down so we can get a picture of the electronics above the fender liner. This is going to help us put everything back in place when we're done. To make removing the driver's side fender liner a little easier, it is nice to start the plastic clips that hold the electronics on by tapping them with a mallet. The 3 plastic clips that are in a triangle pattern holding the heat shield onto the back side of the fender liner do not need to be removed. To give yourself a little more room on the driver's side, we'll remove the plastic bracket holding the wire harness on. It's an 8 millimeter bolt and a plastic clip. Now that we have the fender liners out and we have access to the turbochargers, now is a good time to spray all of your hardware with some PB Blaster. Let that start soaking while we do the rest of the process. It'll make removing the hardware a lot easier. Next, we're going to drain the coolant. Start by removing the radiator cap. Make sure the engine is completely cooled down before you remove the radiator cap. Then we'll locate the radiator's petcock located on the driver's side of the vehicle. We like to use a 3/8 inch rubber hose connected to the petcock, kind of direct the coolant into a bucket rather than letting it spill all over the floor. Next, using a flathead screwdriver, we will remove the clamps holding the intake tubes and the hot pipes to both the driver and the passenger side turbo. While we're in there, we'll also use a pick tool to release the wastegate plug.
There's a lock, and then you squeeze and pinch here.
Due to the location of the clamp in relation to the shock tower on the driver's side, it makes it a lot easier to use a short, stubby flathead screwdriver for that clamp. We'll now move on to the underside of the truck. We're going to remove the transmission skid plate to gain access to the downpipes. The skid plate's held on by 2 10 millimeter bolts and 4 13 millimeter bolts. They all need to be removed completely. The 13 millimeter bolts are located on the sides of the skid plate, and the 10 millimeter bolts are underside towards the front. In order to gain access to the passenger side oil drain, we need to move the starter forward. We do not need to remove the starter completely from the vehicle. We do not need to remove any of the starter's electrical from the vehicle. We're just simply moving it forward. This will take 2 13 millimeter bolts, loosen that starter up, and you may have to get a pry bar in there to just shift that starter forward and give you access to the oil drain. Next, we're going to loosen the downpipe from the hot side of both turbos. Both sides have 15mm nuts holding the downpipe in place. Remove those nuts and loosen the downpipe from the turbo. We're not removing it completely from the vehicle. We're just giving ourselves some room to work. We'll then move downstream on the downpipe and loosen the two 13mm bolts holding the ball flange together, and then the two 15mm nuts holding the clamp on. This way we can slide the downpipe back and out of the way. We're now focusing on the passenger side only. We will do the driver side once we're fully complete with the passenger side. We like to do one side at a time. Right now we're going to move the hot pipe out of the way and pull the inlet pipe up and out of the way as well. We will now move on to removing the passenger side turbo. We're going to be removing lines, and in order to get to the lines, we have to get the wastegate actuator out of the way. We'll start by removing the three 10mm bolts holding the wastegate actuator in place, and then rotate it backwards towards the rear of the vehicle to make some more space for yourself. Next, we'll remove the oil feed line from the block. We'll use a 3-inch extension and a T45 Torx. Then the water line in the block, using a 6-inch extension and a T45 Torx. Then we'll remove the oil feed line in the turbo using a T45 Torx, and now the oil feed line can be removed completely. You'll need to use a pry bar to pop the feed line out of the turbo. Next, we're going to remove the T45 Torx from the oil drain line in the block, and then we will remove the three 12mm bolts holding the turbo to the manifold. Now, we're going to wiggle the turbo to release all of the coolant. We're releasing the coolant before removing the oil lines to ensure that we do not get coolant in the oil. Once coolant stops draining, we're then going to remove the coolant line from the block and let the coolant drain out again. Now we've removed all of the coolant from the system, and you should have very little left in the turbo. We have now removed the oil feed line completely from the vehicle. The oil drain line is still in the turbo, but not attached to the block. Both coolant lines are still in the turbo, but not attached to the motor. Now we will wiggle the turbo out of the vehicle with the lines still attached. Now that we have the passenger side turbo completely out of the vehicle, it's time to move on to the manifold. On the passenger side, we have an EGR line that connects to the manifold. We have to remove that EGR fitting from the manifold in order to get the manifold out. Using two large crescent wrenches, we will remove the nut from the fitting that is in the manifold. While doing this, make sure the fitting in the manifold does not twist. You'll use one crescent wrench to hold the fitting that's in the manifold in place, while using the other crescent wrench to turn the nut off of the fitting. You don't want the fitting that's in the manifold to twist. If it does, it can twist the EGR tube and damage it. Now it's time to move on to removing your factory manifold. There are 8 13mm nuts holding the manifold to the head. Some years do have a heat shield in the way. It is okay to bend that heat shield a little bit out of the way to get to the 13mm nuts. With the nuts out, you can now remove the manifold, and then you'll need to remove any remaining studs left in the head. Most will come out and self-extract themselves when you remove the nuts, but any of the manifold studs left will require a 3/16 socket to remove. Before moving on to the driver's side, one of the most important pieces we're going to replace is the oil feed filter. The Gen 3s have a feed filter on the passenger side only. You'll remove that with a 13/16 socket. Replace that with the new one that comes in the install kit. We just got the oil filter out of the passenger side of the block. It's very, very important you replace this oil filter. This filter is filtering all of the oil going into your passenger side turbo. The filter can get clogged up, and then when it gets clogged up, it doesn't allow enough oil to reach your turbo, then starving your turbo of oil, and it's not lubricated well enough, and that's how you end up smoking your turbos. Very important you replace this every time you're replacing a turbo. Removing, replacing a turbo, put a new oil filter in. We'll now move on to the driver's side. We'll start by removing the turbo. First, to give us some more space, we're going to separate the steering shaft. This takes a 13mm. The steering shaft is a square peg going into a square hole, so it is smart to mark this, but you don't have to be too careful. As long as your steering wheel doesn't rotate more than 90 degrees, you will be able to put this back in place without issue. After the steering shaft is out of the way, we're going to remove the oil feed line from the block, again using a 3-inch extension and a T45 Torx. Then we'll remove the water line from the block. Again, same as the passenger side, 6-inch extension with a T45 Torx. Then we'll remove the oil feed line from the turbo. Again, just like the passenger side, T45 Torx. Only difference here from the passenger side is on the driver's side, we're going to remove the oil drain line from the turbo rather than from the block. That will still take a T45 Torx. Then we'll remove the three 12mm bolts holding the turbo to the manifold. And again, we'll wiggle the turbo free to release the coolant. Next, we'll pull the turbo out of the vehicle. It is a little bit more difficult. You have less space on the driver's side than you do the passenger side. You don't need to worry about damaging any of the lines. If you did buy the install kit comes with all the lines. We're replacing all those later on. Next, we'll remove the manifold. Again, same as the passenger side, it's 8 13mm nuts. Pull the manifold and the manifold gasket out, and then remove the remaining studs that stayed in the head with a 3/16. All right, so we now have the turbos off of the vehicle and we're ready to start prepping them to go back on the vehicle. We're gonna replace all of these lines on the bench so that it's easier once you get the turbo in the vehicle. They're already attached. There's not a bunch of fumbling in tight spaces. With the install kit, we will be replacing all of your lines and gaskets. Also, importantly, you will get some silicone lube. We're gonna lube all of the O-rings as we install every O-ring to make sure it slips in and seals perfectly. Over here, we have the driver's side turbo. Over here, we have the passenger side turbo. You will receive oil drain lines. In order to know which one is driver passenger, the passenger side is the longer to clear the starter. In your install kit, you will receive new feed lines. The shorter feed line goes driver side. New coolant lines as well. These have a tab on one side. They're going to overlap each other when they're installed. The tab goes on top, and we'll show you that in a minute. You're also going to receive new downpipe hardware, studs, nuts, new turbo to manifold hardware. Importantly, again, a new feed filter, gaskets for your downpipe to turbo connection, and gaskets to your manifold to turbo connection. So we'll start disassembling this now, get it ready to go back on the truck. If you recall, on the passenger side, we had to remove the wastegate actuator to allow room to work. Now that it's removed, it's flopping around, it's dangling around. I want to keep from bending this arm and damaging this while we're working on this turbo. So the first thing we're going to do is just finger tighten the bolts that you originally took out of here, just to hold this thing in place. You don't need to put them in too far. Again, we're going to be taking these back out in order to get the turbo back in the truck, because we will need to swing this around to get it back in the truck. We'll start then by removing your oil drain line. Again, it's a T45 Torx. Pop your drain line out. That's now trash. Throw it away. As mentioned, we're going to use silicone lubricant on all of our O-rings. Short end goes towards the turbo, long end goes out. We're going to put some silicone lube on this before putting it in the turbo. Pop that back in your turbo. Reuse the hardware that came out originally. Get a few threads started before using your gun to get it back in. Next, we'll take the coolant lines off. T45 Torx again. Save your hardware. As mentioned, the tab goes up. These will take some persuasion to get out of there. It may take a little prying to get these coolant lines out. Again, we will be replacing them completely, so you don't need to worry about damaging them. We will replace these with new lines. Again, lube up your O-rings. When you're installing something with an O-ring on it, you want to press it down in a twisting motion. Shoving it straight in gives it a bigger chance of pinching and causing leaks. Again, like I mentioned, tabbed line goes on top. And we are going to twist it as we insert. And we're gonna replace the hardware. Get it started with your hand. Now we have fresh coolant lines. Now these coolant lines are a 2-piece coolant line with a rubber gasket on the inside. In order to give yourself some more room to get this turbo in the vehicle, separate them. Do not mix them up. Lube the gaskets on the inside again before we insert these back in, and we'll insert those on the vehicle. We're going to remove the turbo to manifold gasket. This is easiest using a pick tool. Pry it out of there. And as you can see, it will leave some residue behind. We're gonna hit that with some air, get all that out of there before putting a new one in. I will just hit this with a little air to get all of this residue out. Now we can install our new gasket. This will press into place. It does flex as you press it in. Should be able to get it in with your fingers, thumbs, pushing that in. Shouldn't need any sort of mallet or anything. Coming around to the back side of the turbo, if you are reusing the turbos that came off of your vehicle, we're gonna leave the downpipe studs in the turbos. If you are replacing your turbos, we have new downpipe studs included in the install kit. Those can go in. If you are reusing your turbos, discard these, you won't need them. The install kit does come with a gasket for your turbo to downpipe connection. We're gonna put this on the turbo on the vehicle. This won't go on right now. Save that for later. Your oil feed line also will go on once the turbo is in the vehicle. Save that for later. Now we'll move on to the driver's side. Same process on the driver's side. Also, we left our oil drain on the vehicle. We're not gonna put that on the turbo right now. We will take our drain and replace the drain that's on the vehicle before putting the turbo in the vehicle. So the only lines you have to replace on your driver's side are your coolant lines. We're gonna do the same thing, T45 Torx. Pop that off. Okay. One out. Again, this will likely take a bit of persuasion. Same thing as the other side. The tab goes on top. Lube your O-ring. Like we mentioned over on the passenger side, this is a 2-piece coolant line. The female side always goes on the turbo. The male side always goes on the motor. Insert that while twisting. Then we'll put our next one in. Tab on top, female side in the turbo. Lube our O-ring. Twist it in. Okay, then we'll replace our T45 Torx hardware. Get a few threads started with your fingers. All right, and again, we're going to pull the motor side out so that we have more room to work. We're going to remove now the turbo to manifold gasket. Again, you're gonna make a little bit of a flaky mess, but that's okay, we'll blow it out. Okay, discard that. A little bit of air. Press your new gasket in. All right, again, we have downpipe studs still in the turbo. We're reusing these turbos, so we're leaving the downpipe studs in. New studs if you're replacing the turbos. This is your downpipe nuts. Obviously, those are gonna go on when we connect your downpipe to your turbo. Downpipe gasket will go on once the turbo's in the vehicle. And your turbo to manifold hardware as well. Now that your turbos are prepped, we're gonna put the EGR fitting in your manifold. We're gonna finger tighten this now. We're gonna tighten it fully on the truck. We're gonna use the anti-seize packet that came with your manifold, and we're going to apply anti-seize to the threads. We will finger tighten that into the manifold. Again, this will be fully tightened once we're in the truck. Your manifold came with manifold gaskets. We're gonna throw the ones away that we just took off, and we're gonna use brand new gaskets. The manifolds also came with Inconel studs. They're Inconel so they resist stretching under high temps, and nuts, brand new. We're gonna replace all of your studs and nuts. So let's get into putting all this back on the truck. We will now begin installing the manifolds and turbos on the vehicle. Before we start, we want to use a little bit of Scotch-Brite to clean the mating surface on the head and a little bit of air to blow out the stud holes. This will allow the studs to thread in cleanly. We'll start on the passenger side by replacing all 8 studs with the included Inconel 7mm inverted torque studs. Once torqued, we will install the manifold gasket and then the manifold using the supplied 13mm nuts. Once those are torqued, we'll move on to the EGR fitting. And remember, we left this loose earlier. Now that we have the manifold installed on the head, we have some leverage to fully tighten this EGR fitting. Use a large crescent wrench, and then while holding the flare from the EGR2 to the flare on your fitting, fully tighten the nut using the leverage from a large crescent wrench. Now we'll put the turbo up in the frame rail. Once the turbo is up inside the frame rail, we're going to use the oil drain line to guide the turbo into place by inserting the drain into the block. We will then slide the male ends of both of the coolant lines into the female ends. Leave the wastegate actuator swung out of the way to allow room to install the water lines and the inlet pipe later in the process. We will tighten this later. Attach the turbo to the manifold using the 3 12mm bolts, but do not fully tighten them yet. Snake the oil feed line in between the compressor cover and motor mount, and attach this to the motor and the turbo by reusing the T45 Torx. We'll reuse the T45 Torx to reattach the coolant line to the block, and then we'll reuse the T45 Torx to attach the oil return to the block. Finally, we'll reuse the 13mm bolt removed from the back of the head to reattach the coolant line to the back of the head. Now that everything's in place, we can fully tighten the turbo to the manifold using a 12mm socket. Moving over to the driver's side, we'll now replace all 8 of the studs with the supplied 7mm inverted Torx Inconel studs. If your truck has a block heater like our motor does, you'll want to hold the gasket to the head while finger tightening the studs into the head. This will allow you to navigate around the block heater. Once the studs are torqued, you will then install the manifold using the 8 13mm supplied nuts. Again, we'll put the turbo up inside the frame rail. Just like the passenger side, we will use the oil drain to guide the turbo into place. This time though, the oil drain is currently attached to the block. We will slide the turbo onto the oil drain and then slide the male ends of both of the coolant lines into the female ends that are attached to the turbo. Attach the turbo to the manifold using the 3 12mm bolts. Again, do not fully tighten them. Snake the oil feed line in between the compressor cover and the motor mount, and attach the motor and the turbo by reusing the T45 Torx. We'll then reuse the T45 Torx to reattach the coolant line to the block, and we'll reuse the T45 Torx to attach the oil return to the block. Finally, reusing the 8mm bolt, we'll reattach the coolant line to the back of the head. Now that everything's in place, we'll fully tighten the turbo to the manifold using a 12mm socket. Moving on to the inlet and hot pipes for both sides of the turbos. Once the inlet pipe is in place on the passenger side, there is very little room to plug the wastegate in. So we suggest you plug this in now. Start by placing the inlet pipe in place in front of, but not on the turbo. Next, bolt the wastegate back onto the turbo by reusing the 10mm bolts. Then, plug the wastegate plug back in. Push the inlet pipe and coupler and the hot pipe and coupler onto the turbo, and then tighten the clamps with your flathead screwdriver. On the driver's side, the actuator is already attached, so this can be plugged back in now. Then reinstall the inlet and hot pipe, again tightening the clamp down with a flathead screwdriver. Next, we're going to reinstall our starter. You're going to push the starter back into place and tighten the two 13mm bolts to fasten it. Now we'll install the downpipe back onto the turbos. You want to start by replacing the 2 donut gaskets on the back side of your turbos. You'll then put the backside portion of the downpipe together first. There'll be, again, 2 13mm bolts on your ball flange and 2 15mm nuts on the downpipe clamp. Then the downpipe will connect to the turbo, 2 15mm nuts on both sides. All right, we have a few housekeeping things to take care of underneath the hood. Make sure you reconnect your inlet pipes to your intake. We're gonna verify our petcock is closed on our radiator and fill the cooling system with coolant. Attach your negative terminal to your battery to provide power. And then we're gonna move on to probably the most important part of the whole process, which is priming the turbos with oil. If you do not prime your turbos with oil and you start the truck, the turbo starts spinning without any lubricant inside of them, you will damage the turbos. This is very important. To do this, we're gonna put our foot on the brake as well as on the gas, making sure the gas stays all the way to the floor the entire time. This will prevent the motor from actually starting. We'll then turn the motor over as many times as it takes to build oil pressure in the system. Your oil gauge is at the top of your dash. Watch that. Once you build oil pressure, you're good. The turbos are primed. So, I'll put my foot on the brake, foot on the gas, all the way to the floor. Hold it there, do not lift. Turn the motor over. No oil pressure yet, we'll do it again. You can see the oil pressure climb. That's showing that you now have pressure in your system. Now that we primed our turbos, we're good to start the vehicle, climb back underneath, and verify that there are no leaks. And that just about wraps up the install of the full race Formline manifolds on the Gen 3. All that we have left to do is reinstall the skid plate, reinstall the fender liners and flares, put the wheels back on, drop it on the ground, and enjoy the new manifolds. If you have any questions at all through the process, leave the comments below, reach out to us, we're happy to help.